There are countless books, white papers, blog posts, workshops, and TED Talks about building a community, all offering complex models and guidelines. A strong and cohesive community is pretty simple. It's just bringing together people with similar interests and challenges to learn, connect, and serve for the good of themselves and others. Communities that make a difference understand the chances one gives are just as important as the chances one takes. That's why CEO.com clubs exist, to give and take chances on ourselves and others. CEO.com clubs are exclusive, invite-only communities that connect visionary leaders based on specific challenges, industry focus, and leadership goals. We do this in various ways, including providing a private social network for community members only, highly curated leadership events, access to our member directory, and, well, you get the idea. You can learn all about the array of benefits at ceo.com/clubs. More than anything, what CEO.com clubs uniquely do better than anyone else is bringing leaders with similar interests and challenges together to ask each other the following two questions. How can I help you? And how can we give a chance to someone else? If you're a leader in a specific industry who wants to give and take chances on yourself and others, CEO.com has a club for you. Life is more gratifying and full of purpose when you become someone who gives as many chances as you take.
People need to be connected to each other, and people need to be connected to the work that they're doing. And there is so much communication that just doesn't happen, even in this setting where we're on Zoom. You just don't get the connectivity that you can get with the bandwidth that you do if you're in person. You don't see whether the person is slightly annoyed, whether they're looking necessarily at their screen because they're looking at their email or they're looking directly at you. And those moments actually create so much more connection and so much more trust. And it's been really incredible to see.
Satyen, thank you so much for coming on the show. You are the CEO and co-founder of Alation, which I've been looking at your company all morning. It's super fascinating and incredible the way you're utilizing AI in a way that makes it like an actual AI company. I don't know if there's so many young startups are putting AI on their homepage, and really they just have like a chat GPT integration. What you're doing is really, really cool. Tell us how you became the CEO and co-founder.
I really founded the company, and Clint, thank you for having me, and great to be here. I founded the company 12 years ago with 3 other co-founders. We were all people that came at the problem of understanding data from a slightly different perspective. In my own case, I grew up as an analyst and was an analyst by training. So I did academic training and work in economics. And after doing that, I was a financial analyst on Wall Street. And after doing that, I built business software for Oracle that would help companies analyze their data, mostly banks and financial software companies. And so that was my experience. But then I found 3 other co-founders, one of whom was a expert on human-computer interaction and came out of Stanford. Another one of whom was an expert on AI and did his PhD on fuzzy learning, and another one of whom was an expert in databases. And the 2 latter folks came out of Google. And so the 4 of us came together and broadly said, look, data just needs to be easier to comprehend and understand. And that's what allowed us to sort of give birth to Alation.
And what do you make of the innovation that's happened? It's not like AI is new. There was probably some version of AI going on. There's been versions for decades, but particularly 10 years ago. What do you think now, with the rise of AI and how rapidly it's changing and developing? What do you think that means for your business? What do you think that means? Because AI is only as good as the data you feed it. And it seems like the way you're handling it and making sure that companies have access to their proprietary data is kind of going to be the whole thing, right? It's really interesting.
Yeah, but it's sort of fraught, because you would think that AI would really be able to understand what's inside of computer systems much more easily than sort of the things that humans can understand. So, the systems that store a company's general ledger, the systems that store its best customer data, things like Salesforce and NetSuite and Oracle and PeopleSoft and Siebel and Workday, all of these things are things that companies and customers use to store their most critical and strategic data. But these new large language models are primarily trained on text and primarily trained on unstructured files. And a lot of that technology is about predicting the next thing. And so if you say, hi, what's your name? The corpus of information would get searched and it would be like, my name is Satyen Sangani. And so the way that the computer is reasoning out is it's sort of just predicting the next set of things given the context that it's been given. And that's really a problem of a lot of compute, which is why you see all of the spend on these NVIDIA chips and these GPUs, because it's really about compute and processing power. That's been the major innovation that these models have taken advantage of. And so, but the problem is, of course, that this textual information, which is predictive and stochastic and possibly a little bit random, which is why you see all these hallucinations, doesn't necessarily speak well to your business information systems, which rely on precision and which rely upon having a single definitive answer. If somebody says, what are your profits? It doesn't need to be like, well, it might be, possibly 3.72443. You don't want it to guess, you want it to know. And so where Alation sits is kind of in the middle between these two things. We enable companies to figure out how to get these really unstructured models, these generative models, to talk to their most critical business's most critical systems and really get something that's comprehensible and reliable out of it.
What do you think, like how rapidly is AI changing to the point where, how much time are you spending like studying the changes and figuring that out versus like building your product, focusing on your customers? Is it really going as rapid as people say, or do you have like the time and ability to really kind of focus in on what you're doing, your product and your customers?
I think that's the only thing you frankly can do. You obviously have to understand and leverage the biggest and best and most interesting tools in the market, and certainly that's coming from OpenAI and Google Gemini to a lesser extent, and folks like Anthropic. And then even Meta is obviously doing a lot of interesting work with open source. Those companies are pouring in literal billions of dollars into building and training some of the best models. So you are, unless you're massively well capitalized, unlikely to be at that bleeding edge of the technology. So then the question really is, well, what can you learn and leverage from the latest models? And what's interesting is that those models themselves are moving so quickly, but even the older versions of the models in many cases are ones that we haven't quite figured out how to take advantage of fully because the technology is so nascent and so new. But the best thing that you can do is really figure out, okay, what is the problem my customer's trying to solve? What are we trying to do? How can the model help? What are the use cases that we can use to apply this technology to? And I think that's true for ourselves. And frankly, it's true for most people that are now consuming and experiencing and interacting with these technologies.
How do you think about AI governance given the importance and sensitivity of this data?
Yeah, so one of the big challenges that all of these enterprises have is that they don't actually even know what's being used and where these AIs are existing inside of their companies. Who's using ChatGPT? What are they using it for? Customer interactions? Are they using it for programming? Who's using these other models? Are they using it for internal productivity use cases, or is it being used for external applications? Are we buying third-party applications that themselves contain AI? And what aspects of AI exist? Now, one is just an existence question, which is like, where are we using this stuff? And the reason you want to know where we're using this stuff or whether we're using this stuff is because you are now letting a machine intermediate what previously a human might have done, or sort of accelerating work that a human might have themselves had to sweat. And so there's real risk that the machine is getting it wrong. And so you need to know exactly where these things are being used so you can figure out whether or not there's massive risk or significant risk or small risk in making sure that your business is not adversely affected by these AIs. And obviously an agent or a LLM, can make some very innocuous, easy decisions and suggestions, but it's also the case that they can make really bad recommendations that could be damaging to your reputation as a company, or could be financially damaging. And so knowing, one, where the existence of these models is, two, the data that's feeding these models and the versions of the models that you're using, and three, who's using these models and how they're being used in a company, is just table stakes. Now, I would argue that most companies don't even know those things. And today, what people need is essentially a form of governance. People talk historically a lot about this thing called data governance, which is really having an awareness and the ability to apply policies and regulations and rules to the use of data within a company. Very similarly, you've got to do the exact same thing with AI. And there are starting to become regulations. There was a recent California bill that was just actually not passed, but came close to passing. I think it was SB 1407. And there's also, of course, the EQ AI Act. And all of these acts are basically being put into place because people need to be able to identify what AI exists. And in some cases, some of these regulations are saying you got to put a kill switch on this stuff. And so if you're going to be a company that's going to use this stuff, which you have to because you have to use it to stay competitive, then you've got to basically know what you've got and how you're going to be able to control and manage it.
Can you give us like a typical use case for somebody, a client or a customer of Alation, and how they use your product?
Yeah. So often we're being used by technical teams and data teams and business teams. And so people who basically use data. And interestingly, there are different sort of ownerships or sort of lenses of data, right? If you think about what data is just a electronic representation of the world of my business. So, a customer contact list is a slice of my business. My general ledger is a slice of my business. All of the visitors to my website in the last 48 hours is a slice of my business. And all of these kind of slices, you can piece them together to sort of reproduce, that elephant. There's that sort of old tale of the blind man and the elephant. And so what people are trying to do in these very complicated businesses that, mostly are interacting with digital customers or complicated customers or customers all over the world, they're just trying to reproduce what really happened. Now, the problem in reproducing what really happened is that you don't necessarily know where the data came from. You don't necessarily know the assumptions that the programmer had when they were producing this information. You don't necessarily know what the term definition means. So like somebody might say cur bal underscore C. Well, what does that actually mean? Like, what is that thing? And how do I actually understand how to use that particular thing? And how does that differ from cur bal underscore C? And maybe one is the foreign currency balance. The other one is the domestic currency balance, but you wouldn't necessarily know that if you were just coming to some random table in a random database. So what Alation does is it helps people really collaborate around this information. It helps people understand what those things mean. And we are a incredibly sort of modern, sophisticated platform in that we bring all of this AI to bear and all of this cloud compute to bear to basically translate data speak from technologists into human speak for people that are trying to motivate and run the business forward. And so we're really kind of a translation tool, as it were, but also we're a collaborative knowledge base because these companies grow up over years and years and years with all of these different systems, thousands of systems, tens of thousands of tables. And it's really difficult to sort of reproduce what happened. And we help companies sort of reproduce what happened and understand the data that helps them understand their own businesses.
What do you read throughout the week? And what reading recommendations would you have for our audience?
I have a pretty diverse diet. I do listen to podcasts. So there's a couple of different ones that I really love. One is actually The Rest is History, which is a podcast about various historical events, and they both dive in deep into sort of various people and various events in history, which has been awesome. I do get news from a couple of different places. The Economist is one. The New York Times is another. It's hard these days, though, to figure out what news diet you're going to get because sometimes stuff is really biased, which is true for data and true for news. And then I do a lot of sort of what I'll call grazing. I'll just find different stuff that I find on the web and different articles about what's current. And then big book reader. So the two recent books that I read, one was by a guest that I had on my podcast, a guy named Chris Wiggins, who's a Columbia professor, called How Data Happened, which was about the birth of data. And then another one, I just went to Chicago with my son, and so read a book about the Devil in the White City, which was a really great history novel. So I would say I'm kind of pretty eclectic in my taste, but hopefully try to keep it interesting and like to read stuff that expands how I think about things just as much as I do about my regular day-to-day data stuff.
Oh, yeah, I love that. What does a typical day look like for you then as CEO of this company?
I try to wake up every morning, and the first thing that I've done, and this is actually a new habit, like 60-ish days old, is to just do something for my body every single morning. So whether it's like a yoga session or a workout, and on days that I'm super busy, the permission that I've given myself is that I can be just 10 minutes long, but I do something just to get my body moving. I also then have a ritual of making myself a cup of chai, which is pretty meditative for me because it sort of allows me to really focus on how I do it, which sounds kind of silly, but like literally the act of just like putting in the spices and doing it in a certain sequence, and like it just like sets me for the morning. I will then check email. So I try not to check email first thing. That's been a pretty good hack that I've acquired over the last 4 months, which has changed sort of my early outset for the day. And what's interesting is like a lot of these habits are new. Like I would say that the anti-pattern had historically been wake up in the morning, look at my phone first thing, start answering emails first thing. And that's been not doing that has been a real just incredible unlock in terms of just my own mental thinking and framework. Then dive into my day. And so the day can start with a variety of internal and external meetings, generally meeting with at least a customer or a partner or a couple once every single day. Typically, we'll have team and organizational meetings. I have some regular meetings, which are one-on-ones, but mostly do a lot of sort of meeting in a group setting. And as a CEO, I like really want my entire team to hear what each other is thinking, but also what I'm thinking. And then towards the end of the day is when I try to schedule some of my work. But sometimes I would say one day a week, I'll try to block out space so that I can really just, do my own reading and writing and not have to be in meetings all day.
Yeah, yeah. As you think about culture and building a culture and building values, like how do you think about that? How have you built that inside of Alation?
For me, so I think culture fundamentally is defined as basically the set of habits and values of a people. So culture isn't, it could be. I mean, it could be being super enthusiastic and expecting everybody in the company to be super enthusiastic at all times. And then you're like, everybody's rah, rah, and like, we're all enthusiastic. We love this place. And so it could be that. That's not our culture. I think a lot of what you're trying to figure out is what do you reward, what do you recognize, and in some cases, what do you criticize or punish, or at least correct. And so a lot of what I think about is when people follow the right process, when people are being brave, when people are supporting each other, when people are going above and beyond and doing things that are really hard work, and those are the sorts of things that you want to try to celebrate. And I think what we see inside of Alation is that there are a whole bunch of employees who do the same thing for each other. And so a lot of what people talk about when we do employee sat surveys is, what do you love about Alation? Do you like all hands? Do you like the food? Do you like the office? Whatever it is that people can possibly like. The number one thing through the years has always been, well, I really like my colleagues and I really like the people. And I think it's because people have this sort of shared value of really wanting to make progress and be ambitious, but also that they're somewhat supportive to each other. And I think that balance is what I really think about trying to get right.
How have you thought about the whole work from home versus in office versus hybrid at Alation?
We are fumbling through it, but I think making a ton of progress. Just starting this last month, we have brought people back 2 days a week. It's pretty likely that we'll move to 3 days a week, starting at the beginning of the year. We have yet to make that final decision. But what we found is that the energy in the office is actually pretty incredible. I was actually a little bit worried. I was worried that people would see it as a drag on their time, that they wouldn't, of course, want to commute, that it's a massive change of habits. Certainly, if you're a parent with kids, that makes it so much harder because you've got pickups and drop-offs, which you're working from home. Could be a little bit easier if you're at home. People need to be connected to each other, and people need to be connected to the work that they're doing. And there is so much communication that just doesn't happen, even in this setting where we're on Zoom. You just don't get the connectivity that you can get with the bandwidth that you do if you're in person. You don't see whether the person is slightly annoyed, whether they're looking necessarily at their screen because they're looking at their email or they're looking directly at you. And those moments actually create so much more connection and so much more trust. And it's been really incredible to see. So I used to be super biased towards making sure everybody came into the office every day. And then, of course, with the pandemic, we all had to adapt and we went to a remote first company. I will say that I'm probably full circle on this. And I'm of the view that people just have to be together. And especially when you're trying to innovate, there are some moments and some jobs where you're really trying to optimize for individual task productivity, and that person doesn't have to collaborate. But that's so rare in the modern workforce in terms of knowledge workers and what we have to do. Like most of the time, what you're doing has to depend on somebody else or does depend on somebody else. So yeah, I'm a huge proponent of building that connection.
How have you thought about raising venture capital? If I understand it right, you raised in 2022 $123 million Series E, led by Thoma Bravo, an incredible fund, actually. You're valued at 1.7, at least at that time, 1.7 billion. How have you thought about that? And how are you thinking about the public markets right now? You get to Series E, you're starting to look at that, I'm sure.
Yeah. So I think I remember when I first started raising my series, my seed round, and I remember going to meet with investors, and I was so nervous. And I would be on Sand Hill Road, and I would park in the parking lot of these venture capitalists, and you just be super geared up, and in some ways like anxious and nervous about meeting with these people, and it would be life and death in some sense because you obviously needed to pay your salary. And I'm privileged enough to have gotten past that first milestone and, 4 or 5 fundraises since. And it's funny because now, sort of so many years later, having been on the other side of that, fundraising is a means, not an end. We all celebrate the idea of raising money. It's obviously a thing that makes the news headlines. People talk about it all the time. But the reality is that you're using these funds in order to produce value. And the act of actually getting valued doesn't itself produce any value. And in fact, the day after a fundraise as an entrepreneur, you strictly own less of the same exact thing you owned, plus a little bit of cash or a lot of cash, depending on how much you've raised. So I've really, increasingly felt like, one, we over celebrate fundraising, but two, I think that it's something that you want to really use as a conversation, not as, you obviously need to sell. Like you've got to, as an entrepreneur, you've got to sell your ideas. You've got to, sort of distort this future version of reality, as sort of Steve Jobs talked about, in order to be able to explain to people why the world is going to move in the way that you're going to build it. But for me, it's always been a discussion of the problem statements. What are the problems that we are trying to solve? Why are we the best people to solve those problems? Why have we done the best thought? Why our product ideas are the best? And if you can make it a conversation with your investors, then you're going to attract the right type of investor versus somebody who you're selling just a bill of goods to and who, at the first sign of something going wrong will, ditch you. So I think the best investors and the best entrepreneurs are partnered together to figure out how to make something bigger. And if you can find that investor and think about it as a conversation, you're going to have a lot more credibility than just trying to sell somebody your idea and not listening to their feedback, but much more critically, not listening to the fact that both of you are trying to create a shared outcome together.
What have you learned about how your leadership style kind of needs to change as the company grows? Early stage is much different being a leader of that company than where you are now. How have you thought about that and kind of the progression you need to make as a leader?
Yeah, there's all of these new articles kind of discussing this age-old issue. So Paul Graham, who, started YC, had this founder mode, manager mode comment. And then, people are like, oh no, it's not founder mode and manager mode, it's owner mode. And, all of these things speak to the idea of how much do you delegate and let other people run with versus how much you yourself get into the detail. And I think early on, I was just a strict micromanager. I'd walk around and I'd love Google Sheets, and they're running jokes inside of the company around how I'd have task lists and to-do lists. And it was definitely the case that I went way too long with the spreadsheet and the to-do list and running team meetings with to-do lists. And that was definitely a mistake. Where, you can't, especially if you want great people. Great people do not want to necessarily be told what to do. They want to be given a problem that they're capable of solving, and then run with that problem so that they can go figure out the solution to it. The other side, of course, is going to full on delegation. And often you hire executives and individuals who just might be like way abstracted from the problem, might not get into the weeds, might just be like, look, my entire job is to hire people and I don't really necessarily get involved. And that doesn't quite work either. And as a CEO, you can fall into that mode. And the real thing that I've found is in any given moment, there are one or two or three initiatives that you have to drive. There are things that just have to get done. They're the most critical things in the business. And you have to pick your own sort of state and go arbitrarily detailed on those things, right? That's the sort of, Elon Musk, I sleep on the factory floor kind of moment, but you've got to pick those spots. And to drive the business forward, you've got to make sure you get those things right. And then there's sort of everything else where you really want to trust and delegate to your team and do the rational things of QBRs and business reviews and making sure that everybody's kind of coordinated and really rely upon sort of management best practices by doing one-on-ones and team meetings and OKRs and metrics. And that abstraction is really helpful, but you can't totally abstract from every single thing out there and not have any project ownership, because as a founder, the one thing you have as a CEO, the one thing you have is the ability to drive change forward. And so that's been a big learning for me, which is to be really judicious about where to pick the spots. And I struggle with it all the time because you're constantly sort of slippery sloping either into too much management and not enough and too much delegation, or on the flip side, in some cases, doing too many detailed reviews about things that really don't matter and that really your team can figure out.
Kind of the reverse is that is like a lot of CEOs now are being asked to comment on things that are happening outside their company, basically like cultural or society issues or things like that, which maybe wasn't the case like a decade ago. How have you handled that? How have you thought about your role in, society now, where it does seem like business leaders are being asked to comment on things that are outside of their companies?
It's really challenging. And I've, like many of these things, whether it's back to office or culture, we all are learning and we're all trying to figure our way out. And I don't think there's a single clear answer. On one hand, there are people who take the view that sort of they're going to opine on everything. Like every political event is something that they've got to necessarily comment on, or at least the ones that they feel strongly about. And they're going to get out there and they're going to talk about these things. And on the other hand, there are people who are like, look, I'm not going to comment on a single thing. And, I would say I probably veer more towards the latter, that I'm more inclined to not want to share my political viewpoints than I would be to try to share everything. And, for the sick reason that frankly, I'm not a politician. I don't have awareness and depth of knowledge on the most recent issues in all cases. Even though I might read a lot, I probably don't read as much as these people. I'm certainly not elected. I'm not elected by my customers. I'm not elected by my people. We are a for-profit corporation, and the people that elect me are my board. And what my board pays me to do is to go make them more value for their shares. And that's, I think, largely what my employees care about as well, in addition to building a great culture. But I think in building a great culture, there are certain moments where you do have to be better than silent. One example was the George Floyd case. We put out a blog post that I co-authored with my CPO at the time, my chief people officer. And there were a lot of our African-American employees who were really hurting, just really struggling with who they were, what their identity was in the moment, how they were being received and perceived. And that was a really important moment for them. And so I think you do have to be empathetic in moments to your people, but I think it's really to your people. Most of my customers don't care about what my political opinions are, and they shouldn't. I think it's a balancing act, and you've got to really pick, and there's no great rules, but you've got to think about your constituencies, what your business does, where it lives, and then I think pick your spots, but be pretty careful about doing it.
We're getting to the end of the year here, end of 2024, and obviously we have an election coming up. I don't know when this will air, so maybe it would have already happened. How are you thinking about 2025 from a market perspective, from a business perspective? 2024 did seem like it was a little bit hard for tech companies. Do you expect that to kind of continue, or how are you thinking about and planning for 2025?
We are expecting a little bit of the loosening of the markets, but frankly, not a massive change from the current state. Certainly, I think whether there's a Trump presidency or a Harris presidency will impact tech M&A probably more than anything else. So depending on, and it's not clear where Kamala Harris would go as far as the FTC is concerned, but to the extent that antitrust regulation and tech mergers are less prohibited, it seems like the Trump administration would be much more active. And I think that would make for a really exciting environment, because if there's more or less consolidation, that would change the business dynamics pretty robustly. And so I think you could see a situation where there are dynamics in the business changing. I think with interest rates falling, you might also see the threshold for going public decline a little bit. You might see a little bit more spend. There's been a lot of spend allocation towards AI. Unclear whether that will arrest or whether that'll simply accelerate. I can see both sides to that story. But we're not planning for it to be, I would say, some reversal, if you will, to the 2022 days or the 2021 days, frankly, where it was zero interest rates and SaaS companies were the best business model in the world and everybody was simply spending on SaaS and not even questioning that spend. I do think that spend is going to be much more judiciously measured. And that's, I think, a really healthy thing. I mean, frankly, there's a lot of software in the world and it's really hard to make all of it work. And if you're a CIO, you've got to figure out how to make all of this stuff function in your environment and actually get value. And just because a computer program exists, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to make your life better or your customers' outcomes better. And so you've got to be really thoughtful about implementing and delivering this stuff. And I think that's how it should be, frankly.
Finally, we end every interview with the same question, and that is, at CEO.com, we believe the chances one gives is just as important as the chances one takes. When you hear that, who gave you a chance to get you to where you are today?
Ooh, so many people. Do I have to pick one?
Whatever you want. Yeah, go ahead.
Three people that come to mind. One is my high school history professor. His guy name was just a guy named Chuck White. He just inspired me with American history and had a huge impact in my going to college, where I did, and was just somebody who really deeply believed in me. I think, oh man, the two women in my life that are just incredible are my mother and my wife. Both of them have kind of done all of the work to build our family and to believe in me. And, my wife was our first venture capitalist. She's the reason why I even started the company in the first place. So certainly the two of them get far less recognition than I do. And then I, the journey of being an entrepreneur has been incredible. But as I go back to thinking about fundraising, one of my, so the person that's walked every step with me in the journey has been a guy named Greg Sands, who's our lead investor from Costa Nova Venture Capital. Greg is, the first call when there's a problem. And he's somebody who, no matter how bad things are, will always bring perspective and will believe in you, even in moments when you're sort of a little bit unconfident about yourself. And so, gosh, but there's so many people. There's been, the thing about being an entrepreneur is like, you just walk the first step. And then if you have a good enough idea, there are a million people who will walk it with you. And that's every one of your employees and that's every one of your customers. And so on some sense, like the entire process of entrepreneurship is just an exercise of kind of common belief. And if you've done it right, those people will pick you up when you're kind of not able to go a little bit faster and farther. And hopefully you do that a little bit as well.
Thank you so much for coming on. Seriously, it means a lot that you take the time, and best of luck with everything, and best of luck with 2025. I do think you're right about kind of the loosening up a little bit, but it can't be all rosy like it was in 2021, 22. That was crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. Clint, thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you.